ask this question, because biological conundrum, can you imagine what is this conundrum? So you studied the logic. What would be in the opinio juris, the element which would not work? Any idea? Well, the point is that if you say you need practice of states to have a custom, and you need opinio juris, which means the conviction of states that that practice is binding, is demanded by the law. What is not working in this reasoning? What could be considered to be not working in this reasoning? Okay, the meeting for on the study plan, you will receive an email. It's on Thursday, the 7th at 4 p.m. on Teams. Okay. No idea? Yes, please. Yes, thank you. I mean, you practically reached the point. The point is you need practice, and you need the conviction of that the practice is demanded by the law, but this means that this conviction is based on a mistake. Because if you are, you have a practice, and to have custom, you need the conviction that it is based on law. But how can you have the conviction that it is based on law if that is needed to have custom? There is something that, in fact, seen this way does not work from a logical point of view, because at the beginning, the conviction of conformity to the law would be based on a mistake. Because in the beginning, you only have practice. If states behave in a certain way in the beginning because they are convinced that it is demanded by the law, this is a wrong conviction. But the solution, as it has been explained by some experts, and I am convinced by this explanation, the solution comes from a historical perspective. And this is why opinio juris is also called opinio juris sive necessitatis, which means conviction of conformity to the law or of the necessity. Because we can say that in the beginning, states behave in a certain way, practice, being convinced that it is necessary to behave in that way. It is socially necessary to behave in that way. At a certain moment, in a historical perspective, at a certain moment, the conviction of necessity becomes conviction of law, of correspondence to the law. In that moment, we may say in that precise moment, the custom was born. In the precise moment in which the conviction of necessity of a certain conduct becomes conviction of correspondence to the law of that certain conduct. Any question? Any doubt, you may ask me if you have doubts and not your colleagues. It is a bit of a tricky issue, so if you have any question, you may ask, or is it all clear? I think you mentioned the contradiction at the beginning. Yes, the contradiction is that if you are convinced that a conduct is demanded by law, and this conviction is necessary to have a law, this means that your conviction is wrong. So custom would be based on a wrong conviction. But I was saying this, in my view, can be solved in a historical perspective. The conviction starts as a conviction of necessity, of social necessity. Gradually, states behave in a certain way because they feel it necessary. And then at a certain moment, of course, it would be difficult to identify a moment which is the same for each state, but I mean, at a certain moment, the conviction of necessity becomes a conviction of conformity to the law, and that in that precise moment, we may say the law is formed, the custom is formed. Anyway, whatever we think of the logical conundrum, the two elements are required to have custom. On one side, the practice of states, on the other side, the conviction, their conviction that the practice is required, is demanded by the law, that they behave in that way because they are bound by the law to behave in that way, or they have the right, according to the law, to behave in that way. Okay? Yes, please. It is a spontaneous procedure. It's not codified. I mean, it is easy to pass from necessity to law because you think that you do a certain thing because it is socially necessary, and at a certain point, this becomes a conviction that it is legally necessary. Well, opinio juris is necessary among the generality of states as much as practice. Now we are going to see the elements through which to identify opinio juris. But it is always generality. It is not one single state or two or three states. Yes, please. No, no. because it is that practice which is a law if it is accompanied by opinio juris. Otherwise, there would already be another law imposing that conduct. Okay, at home?
Yes, thank you.
Yes,
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay. Now, how can we find evidence of opinio juris? Well, according to the draft conclusions of the International Law Commission, evidence of acceptance as law of opinio juris may take a wide range of forms, and it gives a series of examples, public statements made on behalf of states. So, for example, public statements of the President of the Republic, of the King, of the Prime Minister, of a minister, according to the topic, of a diplomat, official publications, government legal opinions, diplomatic correspondence. So government legal opinions means legal opinion, for example, of an official lawyer counseling the government on legal issues. The diplomatic correspondence, so letters exchanged between diplomats of two or more countries, etc. Decisions of national courts, treaty provisions, treaty provisions are a risky point, because a treaty provision, for example, you have many bilateral treaties of investment between two states, treaties regulating the investment of Italian citizens, for example, in Venezuela, bilateral treaty of investment for Venezuelan citizens in Italy. So reciprocal, neutral. And you have many bilateral treaties of this kind among states, between couples of states. And each one of them provides that if an investment is expropriated by the local state, the territorial state where the investment is done, there need to be a fair compensation. Is this the proof of an opinio juris in relation to custom or not? It is tricky, because the fact that there are many treaties, many treaty provisions in many treaties indicating the same, containing the same rule, regulating in the same way a certain situation, may indicate the fact that states are convinced that that rule corresponds to custom. But not necessarily. It could be that states insert that rule in their treaties because they are convinced it is not required by custom. So they write it down in treaties because it is not corresponding to custom. So if they want to apply that rule, they insert it in treaties. So it is always difficult to derive a customary rule from treaty provisions. What is more important is the conduct of states in relation to some rules, also treaty rules. So, for example, the conduct of non-state, non-party states, states that are not party to the treaty. But treaty provisions are always risky to be used as an element proving custom. The conduct in connection with resolutions adopted by an international organization or at an intergovernmental conference. So this means, for example, the fact that the state votes in favor of a resolution and declares that the resolution is an enunciation of rules of international law. What can you say about this list of elements from which opinio juris may be deduced? You may say that the list is very similar to the list of elements from which practice may be deduced. And this is the fact, because a letter, diplomatic letter, for example, is an element of practice, because the diplomat is writing a letter and sending it to its homologue, to his homologue or her homologue in another country. And this letter expresses the position of the state. This is an element of practice, but at the same time, the expression of the position of the state may show an opinio juris, a conviction of the state in relation to the status of international law. The conduct in connection with the resolution adopted by the General Assembly of the United Nations is an element of practice. It is a conduct. But at the same time, this conduct may show the conviction of the state that the resolution corresponds to customary international law. So, in fact, the process of identifying practice and the process of identifying opinio juris are not always two separate processes. We may even say that they are normally the same process. Through the same process, you will be able to identify the practice of states and the opinio juris of states. Of course, there are some elements that are only practice. For example, the way in which the police treats protesters in the street, the way in which the police treats foreign immigrants. This is just an operational conduct. This is practice. This is not opinio juris. But many elements are elements showing both elements of practice and elements constituting evidence of opinio juris, evidence of the conviction of states regarding their opinions in relation to the correspondence of a certain rule with the law, with international law. Yes. I mean, the practice, of course, is, I was in this case only referring to the fact that, for example, you have a police that mistreats the foreign immigrants. This is only practice, but obviously what you will have to look at is how the state reacts to this. So if there is a reaction on the part of the authorities in investigating and prosecuting issues of mistreatment, then of course the second part of the practice is practice, but it is at the same time opinio juris, because if you have courts convicting policemen because they have mistreated foreign immigrants, this will be an element of practice, but at the same time an element of showing the opinio juris of the state, because the courts are state organs and the courts decide in accordance to law. This is more difficult. You remember the Nicaragua case. So if states proclaim a certain rule, but then they violate that rule, single instances of violation, as the court said, do not contradict the existence of a customary rule, because you have the opinio juris, which is in the law, which says that certain acts are prohibited, and that you have even probably declarations from the state that says that it acts totally in conformity with a certain rule. And then if the operational conduct is in violation of that, if the rule is not applied, the simple fact that it is not applied in some states does not contradict the existence of a customary rule. But of course, a situation in which 90% of states would be enunciating a certain rule and then acting in a different way would be a problem for being able to identify a rule of customary international law. Okay. Okay, thank you for those who indicated the textbook. The textbook is available on UNIME website, the library online. Okay. Everything clear? Okay, very good. Now, the persistent objector rule. We come back to the issue of how much consent counts when we talk about customary international law. As you remember, I told you in the beginning, I don't share the view according to which custom is strictly linked to consent, in the sense that you don't have each time to go and see if the consent of that specific state is proved. However, according to the International Law Commission, there is the possibility for a state to object to a nascent rule of customary international law. So when a rule of customary international law is in the process to be formed, a state can object to that rule, and in that way, that state will not be bound by that rule of customary international law. So there is a possibility of negative consent to prevent the formation of a rule of customary international law. Where a state has objected to a rule of customary international law while that rule was in the process of formation, the rule is not opposable to the state concerned for so long as it maintains its objection. So, and the objection must be clearly expressed, made known to other states, and maintained persistently. This is without prejudice to any question concerning peremptory norms of general international law, jus cogens, but we will come back to jus cogens later on. Now, this rule, which is enunciated by the International Law Commission in its draft conclusions, is in reality the result of a debate which has always crossed international law experts, in the sense that there has been always two theories. According to some, there was a persistent objector rule. According to others, this rule was not existent. Why this debate? Why this opposition of views? Because the practice in relation to the persistent objector rule is very limited. One element of this practice is the Anglo-Norwegian fisheries case. We will go back to this case when we will deal with the law of the sea. This was a case brought by the UK against Norway because Norway was drawing the baseline of its territorial sea in a way which was not liked by the UK, because it was bringing the Norway's territorial sea further out into the high seas, and this damaged the British fishermen who were used to go and fish into the waters which were becoming, as the consequence of this new baseline traced by Norway, were becoming Norway seas, Norway waters. Therefore, English fishermen could no more go there and fish. Anyway, here the debate in this point of the judgment said that recognize the reasons of Norway and not those of the United Kingdom. But anyway, the point debated in this part of the judgment was the so-called 10-mile rule concerning the possibility to close a bay. So the conventions, we will see that the law of the sea conventions, it is a bit difficult for you now maybe to understand what I'm talking about, but the law of the sea conventions define what is a bay, the concept of a bay. And you can close a bay with a certain line. The debate was is the 10-mile rule. So a line which is long 10 miles, no more than 10 miles. So the line, you can close the bay if the line closing the bay is no longer than 10 miles. This would be the rule. This 10-mile rule, which was written in a convention, has not acquired the authority of a general rule of international law, according to the court. The UK claimed it was a rule of customary international law. Norway claimed it was not. In any event, said the court, the 10-mile rule would appear to be inapplicable as against Norway, inasmuch as she, Norway, has always opposed any attempt to apply it to the Norwegian coast. Now, this is a sentence in which the International Court of Justice would seem to recognize the persistent objector rule. As Norway has always opposed the 10-mile rule, this rule, even if it were a rule of customary international law, it would not be opposable to Norway. But this sentence of the International Court of Justice is not so relevant. Why is it not so relevant? Why do you think it is not so relevant? Why? Any sentence of the International Court does not make a precedent. So why this particular sentence is not so relevant? How do you call a sentence like this in a judgment? Is this sentence necessary to decide the case? No, because the case is decided by the fact that the court says the 10-mile rule has not acquired the authority of a general rule of international law. So this sentence, the second sentence, is the so-called obiter dictum. You don't need to remember these Latin words, but the meaning is obiter dictum. This meaning is it is a sentence in a judgment which does not decide the case. So it is something more that a court adds in its reasoning, but which is not necessary to decide the case. So it is not so important, this sentence. And this is one of the really extremely limited elements of practice in favor of the persistent objector rule. That is why various scholars continue to reject the persistent objector doctrine. So I come back to the general rule. The general rule is that if a court needs to decide a dispute, has to decide a dispute, and it has to apply a customary rule to that dispute, to decide that dispute. In order to verify the custom, the court does not need to verify the consent of the two states parties to the dispute to that custom. The courts need to verify if there is a custom, identify the elements of a general practice and the general opinio juris. If it identifies a custom, both states parties to the dispute, which are before the court, will be bound by that custom. It does not need to prove that each of them consented to the custom. But of course, a problem would arise if it found that one of the two states permanently objected to the custom since the beginning of the formation. of the custom. In that case, if the court agrees with the persistent objector rule, it would conclude that the custom is not opposable to that state, as Norway in the Anglo-Norwegian fisheries case. Is this clear? Okay, it is very important that you understand what I explain, because the law is based on logic. So it is very important to understand the logic behind each rule. Yes, I wrote, as Julian is asking, if I wrote persistent objector with a question mark because there are very few real examples. I wrote it with a question mark because the question is still, because there are very few real examples, elements of practice, and because the question is still debated. So the fact if there is or there is not the persistent objector rule is still debated. Although the International Law Commission, and this is certainly important, seems to be now confirming the existence of the persistent objector rule. Okay. You're welcome. Now let us come to particular customary international law. Until now, we have been talking about general customary international law. I have said since the beginning that custom is a source of general international law binding on all states. That is true. However, at least according to international case law and according to normally the prevailing doctrine, it is possible to have also rules of particular customary international law, which means a customary rule of law which is formed not in the whole international community, but only in a region, certain region of the world, or even in a smaller part of the region of the world. And therefore, it applies only among a limited number of states. But in this case, in the case of particular customary international law, there is an important difference with what I was telling you a moment ago with regard to general customary international law. Because in this case, to apply this particular custom to a specific state, you will have to ascertain whether there is a general practice involving that group of states, including that state. I mean, to apply a particular rule of customary international law, a rule of particular customary international law, to a group of states formed by state A, B, C, and D. So to apply it, for example, to state B, you have to prove that there is a practice and an opinio juris and a conviction and an acceptance as law among those four states that involves each one of those four states in their mutual relations. So in this case, the link with consent, the link of the formation of custom with consent is much more palpable than with regard to general customary international law. Let us look at an example to understand it better. The asylum case, Colombia versus Peru. You all have in mind the Julian Assange case. No? You never heard about Julian Assange? Yes. The leader of WikiLeaks. You know that at a certain moment, many years ago, he took refuge in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. Because he feared to be extradited to Sweden, because Sweden was accusing him of some crimes, and then he feared that Sweden would possibly extradite him to the United States, where he is investigated for the WikiLeaks activities, revealing a series of secrets concerning the US government and secret services, etc. So this is a case of diplomatic asylum. We will go back to this concept of diplomatic asylum. Now, in the Colombia-Peru case, asylum case, the claim of Colombia was that diplomatic asylum is something which is provided by a rule of Latin American customary international law. So a rule of customary international law which would only bind Latin American states among themselves. And in fact, this is due to the fact that diplomatic asylum, the practice of diplomatic asylum, has been particularly important in Latin American states, and they even have concluded treaties recognizing diplomatic asylum. But we will come back to the concept of diplomatic asylum later on. Now, the point is, for the International Court of Justice, if there is or there is not this regional customary international law. The Colombian government invoked American international law in general, but when Colombia invoked American international law, this has nothing to do with the United States. Pay attention. American in the sense of Latin American, because the United States are totally out of this practice. In addition to the rules arising from agreements, this is the opinion of the court, which have already been considered. It has relied, no, sorry, it's not the opinion of the court. Colombia has relied on an alleged regional or local custom peculiar to Latin American states. The party which relies on a custom of this kind, according to the court, must prove that this custom is established in such a manner that it has become binding on the other party. So now in the case, the court did not recognize the existence of a custom, but you see from what the court says that the court recognizes the possible existence of regional or local customary international rules. And it enunciates the rule we were mentioning before, according to which it is necessary to ascertain whether there is a general practice among the states concerned that is accepted by them as law among themselves. This is once again, the International Law Commission draft. I think I forgot to put it on but I think these words are the ILC draft. Anyway, it is the International Court of Justice that enunciated these rules on how to identify regional or local international customary law. My question is, I have some doubts on the existence of regional or local customary international law, because my question is, and it is not me, it is also other experts who advanced this idea, isn't that a tacit agreement? Because if you need to prove, in order to have a particular customary international law rule, you need to prove that there is practice plus opinio juris, plus conviction of all the states involved in this rule, bound by this rule. So states A, B, C, D, and D. It is the same as trying to identify a tacit agreement among these states. So an agreement which is not a written treaty. It is a tacit agreement, which means that it is an agreement which has formed without being expressed. Also, among individuals, you may have tacit agreements. You never pronounce some words, we shall do like that, but the way in which you behave demonstrates that you for example, your relatives or your friends agree that a certain thing needs to be done in a certain way. This is not necessarily agreement over a law, but I mean a rule of law. But I mean the way in which you also need the opinion that this practice corresponds to a legal obligation, to a legal rule. But anyway, in my view, a particular or regional or local custom can be reconstructed also as a tacit agreement. It's something a bit different from the general custom, because you need to prove that each one of the states bound by that rule are consenting, have consented to that rule through their behavior. I will first read the question here and then I come to you. So there is a question from Nada. Given a certain custom, do states that respect such custom have to respect it also when it comes to the interaction with a state that has been a persistent objector to such custom? No. Thank you for your question, Nada. If there is a persistent objector and if the persistent objector rule is accepted, the consequence is that the persistent objector is not bound by the rule, and this means that also the other states are not bound by the rule in relation to the persistent objector, because the rules have always to be applied in the mutual relations between two or more subjects. So if state A objects to a customary rule, states B and C shall continue to apply that rule between themselves, but they shall not apply that rule in relation to, in their relations with state A. they will have to apply. Well, it depends on the content of the rule to understand which rule they will have to apply. Yes, please. Well, in the case of particular customer international law, there is no place for persistent objectors. Well, the other nation which is not part of the regional or local rule of customary law is not bound by that custom. So, for example, you have this rule. If you had a rule, a Latin American custom, which provides that states have to recognize diplomatic asylum. This means that the other states are not bound to recognize diplomatic asylum. I mean, let us take the Assange case, but we will come back in the future to this. Let us take the Assange case. Let us consider that Ecuador, as a Latin American state, is part of the Latin American customary rule on diplomatic asylum. Okay, but this rule does not bind the United Kingdom. So the United Kingdom can say to Ecuador, I'm sorry, I do not recognize this diplomatic asylum. You cannot give asylum to Mr. Assange in my territory. An embassy is not Ecuadorian territory. No, it's the territory of the local state. This is an important mistake that many people do, because in the past there was at a certain time a conviction that an embassy could be viewed as the territory of the sending state, but it is not so. But we will come back to all this in the coming future. Yes, please. We will come later on to this point. Yes, please. Well, in my view, I mean, there is no difference in the application. I mean, you find that there is a law, but it is in the theoretical reconstruction of what happened, of what leads to, because in my view, there is a relevant element of custom which is missing here. And it is the point that you can apply custom without necessarily to a certain state without necessarily having to demonstrate the consent of that state. In this case, it is different because you need to go and find the consent of that state. So it is, in my view, it is an important difference which equates these so-called regional customs more to treaties, to agreements, than to custom. But it is my point of view. I mean. Yes. No, not because the persistent objector is not accepted. A persistent objector is something that happens very rarely. So you just have a state which maybe in court it says, well, this rule does not exist. But it has never said that before. So it is not a persistent objector. You do not have to go and verify that it consented to the rule, that it participated in the formation of the customary rule. You just need to prove custom, general custom. Yes, please. In the particular customary international law. Yes. In the particular, you cannot have an objector because you need to have a specified group of states. Welcome. Okay, any other question? Any other question? Excuse me. Okay. And then we have concluded so with customary international law. Well, just 2 words on the question before. Yes, I mean, we can anticipate, yes, a particular custom could prevail on the general custom because it is special law, yes. It is special in the sense that it is only valid in a smaller group of states. But not on Jus Cogens, but we will come back to Jus Cogens. Okay. Then we will start to talk about the other sources of international law. Unilateral acts. Can a unilateral act engage a state? Well, why not? If a state clearly issues an official declaration in which it officially undertakes to comply with a certain rule in favor of another state, for example. We can say that this is possible. It is possible to that a state may bind itself by undertaking to comply with a certain obligation in favor of one or more other states. However, the examples we have in state practice are debatable. And one of the main examples is the nuclear test case brought by New Zealand against France in 1973 and decided by the court in 1974. New Zealand was protesting against the nuclear tests, the French nuclear tests in the Pacific. So it claimed from the court, it requested the court to decide. It brought France before the International Court of Justice, requesting the court to decide that the French nuclear tests in the Pacific were violating international law. These claims were founded on the fact that some of the fallout of these tests was falling onto New Zealand territory. The court found a very good way to escape the question. The court said, I am called to settle disputes, decide disputes on disputes between states. So we need a dispute. But in this case, there is no dispute. There is no dispute because France declared that it will stop its nuclear tests. And France is bound by these unilateral declarations. The point is that the unilateral declarations were not solemn official declarations in which France said, for example, the President of France decides that my country undertakes to stop all nuclear tests in the Pacific on 1st September or whatever, 1974. So at the moment in which the court decided the case, there had been some declarations of French ministers or even prime minister, I don't remember now, according to which I think there still had to be a test from France, and this test would have proved that the technology was sufficiently advanced in order to allow France not to need any more tests to keep its nuclear arsenal and even to develop its nuclear arsenal. So France was saying, now after the last test I will make, we should not need any more tests because we have sufficiently proven our technologies. But it was not a solemn undertaking to respect a certain rule according to which they would never anymore make any nuclear test in the Pacific. But the court considered these declarations as undertakings of a legal obligation under international law. And therefore the court said, okay, the French nuclear tests are terminating, which was in fact the case. The French nuclear tests were terminating, and therefore the subject matter of the dispute between New Zealand and France disappears. Therefore, there is no dispute. New Zealand was not at all happy with that, because New Zealand wanted a judgment of the court deciding that the French nuclear tests were violating international law. But the court was obviously not ready to do that. And also because it would have been difficult for the court, because there were some treaty rules prohibiting nuclear tests of a certain kind, but France had not adhered to the treaty. Anyway, the court avoided. This is one of those occasions in which an international court just uses an easy way, an easy legal reasoning just to avoid a very difficult legal question, legal and political question, we may say. Yes, please. I'm talking about submarine nuclear tests that I think they stopped at that moment. So you're right about the case, the new case of the Greenpeace ship, the Rainbow Warrior ship in 1985. France did under, I don't find the word now, under subterranean tests. I don't find the correct English word. Underground, sorry, I didn't find the word. Underground tests. It did some other underground tests, but I'm not sure now. I don't remember what was the object of the protests of the Rainbow Warrior ship. There is a fact that some Pacific islands continue to have problems today after the French nuclear tests. So I don't remember exactly what was the object of the protests of the Rainbow Warrior ship. Anyway, there was a stop at that time in 1974 of the French nuclear tests, submarine tests, underwater tests. So the issue of unilateral acts, yes, it is possible, but in this case, I would say it was not really, the reasoning of the court was not convincing with regard to the fact that these French declarations corresponded to customary international law. Okay, any question? Okay, other sources. We will, of course, come back to treaties in a much more analytical way. But apart from treaties, we have the treaty-based sources. Treaties may create new sources of international law. This happens in particular within international organizations, because the treaty establishing an international organization may create a source of law, providing that some acts of a specific organ of an international organization produces binding effects on member states. So we have the constitutive treaty of an international organization, which creates a new source of law because it provides that the acts of one of the organs of the organization are binding on the member states. Now, these sources may just be a form of agreements. If the treaty, for example, provides that all member states shall vote in favor of a certain resolution, in order for this resolution to be binding for member states, this is a form of agreement. So we may say it is a secondary agreement because it is provided for certain issues within the functioning of an international organization, within an organ of an international organization. But it is an agreement, it is a treaty. Every time that you need the consent of a group of states to have a binding rule for those states, it is an agreement. So these treaty-based sources are not agreements only if some characters are present. The acts are adopted by majority vote, for example. But they will be binding on all states, even those who voted against or abstained. If you have unanimity of all member states, it is a simplified agreement. Simplified agreement is an agreement which does not require the formal procedures that normally a treaty requires. It's just a simplified treaty. Another possibility to have a properly treaty-based source is that the rule is adopted by a body which is not representing all member states. However, the rule will be binding on all member states. Because in this case, also the states, members of the organization, who are not consenting to the rule will be bound by the rule. Therefore, we may say this is a new source of international law, derived international law, because it is derived from a treaty. We may say second, or if you prefer, secondary international law, because it is a source based on a treaty, such as within a state, the constitution establishes the other sources of the law. So it provides that certain rules may be adopted by laws adopted by parliament. It is the same process. Okay. Is it clear the point that only if the characters I mentioned are present, you have heteronomy? Otherwise, you have autonomy. Autonomy means consent and therefore agreement. Heteronomy means the rules come from an entity which is outside you, or an organ which decides by majority, or an organ which does not represent, in which not all member states are represented, is something which can, an entity which can be considered outside of the subjects, the member states of the organizations, which are bound by the rules adopted. Yes, please. Yes, we will come to examples, yes. No, obviously. So the first example is the Charter of the United Nations. according to Article 25 of the Charter, we will come back to this, but it is already important to consider these issues now. So the treaty-based source in the United Nations, according to Article 25, the members of the United Nations agree to accept and carry out the decisions of the Security Council in accordance with the present Charter. So the Security Council is a body, an organ of the United Nations, which is enabled by the Charter, the constitutive treaty of the organization, to enact rules binding for all member states. And these rules, you find in particular these rules in Article 41 of the Charter, according to which the Security Council may decide on measures not involving the use of armed force that member states will be called upon to apply. We are talking about the so-called sanctions adopted by the Security Council of the United Nations. All member states of the United Nations are bound to apply the sanctions decided by the Security Council, for example, against a certain state that is considered by the Security Council to threaten international peace and security. For example, economic sanctions. So these are normally binding rules, binding resolutions. Resolutions binding on all member states of the United Nations. Now, does the Security Council possess any of the characters I mentioned before? Yes. Why? Because not all countries are on the Security Council, only 15 countries are on the Security Council. 5 permanent members plus 10 non-permanent members. But all the states, and furthermore, the Security Council decides by majority. So there are 2 arguments to say that the rules adopted by the Security Council are properly treaty-based source, a treaty-based source. More recent, I mean, talking about the recent decades. For you, it is already something very old, but a recent development in recent decades of practice of the Security Council is the fact that the Security Council tends to become a sort of legislator, a quasi-legislator. Because yes, the Security Council may decide on sanctions according to Article 41, but sanctions are normally a sort of administrative act because sanctions are applied against a specific state. But since in particular this very important resolution 1373 of 2001, adopted the day after the practically the day after the few days after the 9/11 attacks on the United States. The Security Council used Article 41 of the Charter to impose general obligations on all states relating to the fight against terrorism, against international terrorism. In particular against the financing of international terrorism. But not only. Now, it has been contested by various sides, the fact that the Security Council is enabled to act as a legislator, because in this way, the Security Council is just substituting treaties. Instead of having a treaty agreed to by a certain number of states, the Security Council decides a rule which is binding on everybody. But we will come back to this problem, because when we will talk about the Security Council, in my view, I will just tell you that in my view, Article 41 does not really enable the Security Council to do that, because Article 41, the purpose of Article 41 was to decide measures against specific states threatening international peace and security. And therefore, the Security Council has used Article 41 in a creative way. In the specific case, we may say probably that although some states protested against this, but the great majority did not protest, and we might say that maybe states have acquiesced, so accepted at the end this way of proceeding of the Security Council. Therefore, this resolution may be considered in conformity with international law because of the acceptance of states. But in my view, there is a problem any time the Security Council pretends to act as a legislator, which it also did in some other occasions. There was a question, you had a question? No, not really. What I said is that a treaty-based source is really a new source of international law only when there are some characters that prove the fact that the rule is adopted in a way that it will be binding also on possibly dissenting states. If the rule needs the acceptance of all the states that will be bound by that rule, it is an agreement. So even if we have a treaty-based source formally, because it is the constitutive treaty which provides that a certain organ, for example, this happens in the World Health Organization. The rules adopted by the World Health Organization binds all consenting states, because a state has the possibility at least to dissent in order not to be bound by the rules adopted by the World Health Organization. This is a form of simplified agreement which is adopted within the World Health Organization and also some other international organization. While in order to have a new rule, you need to have really a new procedure. And you may say there is a new procedure when there are elements of autonomy of the international organization in deciding the rules. Autonomy with respect to its own member states. Is that clear? Okay. Any question? No question? No question at home? Okay, thank you very much, and I have a nice weekend. I will see you on Tuesday.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.